It was just an ordinary day until I saw a familiar scar on our cleaning lady's hand. It triggered a flood of painful memories I'd buried deep, bringing back a piece of my past I thought was lost forever. Could it be her? I never thought an ordinary scar could change my life, but that's exactly what happened on a Tuesday afternoon last month. "Ashton, we need to talk about the new hires my business partner, Jake," said as he barged into my office. I looked up from the pile of invoices on my desk, rubbing my tired eyes. "What's up?" Jake plopped down in the chair across from me. "It's Mrs. Rodriguez, the new cleaning lady. The clients can't stop raving about her. She's getting all the good reviews and all the big tips. The other cleaners are starting to notice." I leaned back in my chair, a small smile playing on my lips. Isn't that a good thing? We want our employees to do well. "Yeah, but," Jake hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I'm worried it might cause some tension." I shrugged. "As long as everyone's doing their job, I don't see the problem. Mrs. Rodriguez is just really good at what she does." Jake nodded, but I could see the concern in his eyes. "Just keep an eye on it, okay?" "Will do," I replied, turning back to my work. Little did I know that those words would come back to haunt me. A week later, I was knee-deep in complaints about Mrs. Rodriguez. "I'm telling you, Ashton, she ruined my carpet," Mrs. Jennings, one of our longtime clients, screeched over the phone. I winced, holding the receiver away from my ear. "I understand, Mrs. Jennings. We'll make it right, I promise." As soon as I hung up, my cell phone buzzed with a text from another angry client. "Your expert cleaner ruined my antique rug. It's been in my family for 3 generations and now it's destroyed. I want compensation now or I'm calling my lawyer. Worst service ever?" I groaned, rubbing my temples. This was getting out of hand fast. "What's going on?" I muttered to myself. Jake poked his head into my office. "More complaints." I nodded, feeling a headache coming on. "I don't get it. Mrs. Rodriguez was doing so well and now suddenly she's messing up left and right." Jake's expression darkened. "Maybe she's not as good as we thought." I shook my head. "No, something's not right here. Mrs. Rodriguez is too professional for this." "What are you thinking?" Jake asked, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm thinking we need to do some investigating." The next day, I installed hidden cameras in our supply room. It felt wrong, like I was betraying my employees' trust, but I needed answers. "Are you sure about this?" Jake asked as we finished setting up the last camera. I sighed, wiping my hands on my jeans. "No, but what choice do we have? We need to know what's really going on. Mrs. Rodriguez is a seasoned cleaning lady, and she can't be messing up. We must be missing something." Jake nodded, his face grim. "I hope you're wrong about this, Ashton." "Me too, buddy." As we left the supply room, I had a premonition that something wasn't right. 3 days later, I sat in my office, staring at my computer screen in disbelief. The footage from the hidden cameras played before me, showing 3 of our cleaners, Sandra, Alice, and Maria, tampering with Mrs. Rodriguez's cleaning supplies. "I can't believe this," I muttered, my hands clenched into fists. Jake leaned over my shoulder, his face pale. "Holy, they've been sabotaging her this whole time." I nodded, feeling sick to my stomach. "We need to confront them. All of them, including Mrs. Rodriguez. She deserves to know what's been happening." "I'll call them in for a meeting. Tomorrow morning." Yeah, I agreed, my mind racing. Tomorrow morning. As Jake left the office, I couldn't help but wonder how I would handle this mess. The next morning, I paced my office, waiting for everyone to arrive. Sandra, Alice, and Maria filed in first, looking nervous. Mrs. Rodriguez came in last, confused yet composed. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "We need to discuss something important." As Mrs. Rodriguez took off her jacket, I froze. There, on her right forearm, was a scar. A red crescent-shaped scar that I'd recognize anywhere. Marie's painful ones came flooding back. Suddenly I was 5 years old again, huddled on a doorstep, cold and hungry. And there was Mrs. Rodriguez, though I didn't know her name then, wrapping me in a warm blanket, her kind eyes filled with concern. "No, could it be her?" I mumbled, tears brimming in my eyes. "Mrs. Rodriguez," I slowly approached her. Did you live on Maple Street about 30 years ago?" She looked startled, her eyes widening. "Yes, I did. How did you know that?" I took a deep breath, feeling tears prick my eyes. "Because you saved my life." The room fell silent as Mrs. Rodriguez stared at me, recognition slowly dawning on her face. "Billy," she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Little Billy." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. Mrs. Rodriguez rushed forward, enveloping me in a hug that smelled like lemon cleaner and home. "Oh, my sweet boy," she cried. "I've thought about you every day since then." I hugged her back, tears welling up in my eyes. For a moment I felt like the scared little boy who had been abandoned by his parents. But this time I was safe, cradled in the warm embrace of the woman who had rescued me from darkness. "I never got to thank you, Mrs. Rodriguez. You changed my life that day." She pulled back, cupping my face in her hands. "I'm just so glad you're okay. When I moved away, I always wondered what happened to you." I smiled through my tears. "I got adopted by a loving family. I have a wonderful life now. I'm running a successful cleaning business, married with 3 wonderful kids. It's all thanks to you." Mrs. Rodriguez beamed, her eyes shining. "That's all I ever wanted for you, Billy." "It's Ashton now," I said softly. "But I never forgot about you." A throat clearing behind us brought me back to reality. I turned to see Sandra, Alice, and Maria shifting uncomfortably, looking anywhere but at us. My earlier anger came rushing back. "Do you 3 have any idea who this woman is?" I demanded. They shook their heads, looking terrified. "This woman saved my life when I was a child," I said, my arm still around Mrs. Rodriguez's shoulders. "And you've been trying to ruin her career because you were jealous." Alice spoke up, her voice trembling. "We didn't know. We just thought." "You thought what? That sabotaging her work would make you look better? That destroying her reputation would somehow improve yours?" Mrs. Rodriguez put a hand on my arm. "Ashton, please. I don't want any trouble." I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. "No, Mrs. Rodriguez, you don't deserve this. None of this is your fault." I turned back to the 3 women, who looked like they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. "You're all fired. I won't tolerate this kind of behavior in my company. Pack your things and leave. Now." They didn't argue as they quietly filed out of the office, leaving Mrs. Rodriguez and me alone. She sighed, looking troubled. "Ashton, I feel terrible. I didn't want anyone to lose their jobs because of me." I shook my head, taking her fragile hands in mine. "This isn't because of you. It's because of their actions. You did nothing wrong." Mrs. Rodriguez smiled sadly. "I just wanted to do my best work. I never meant to make anyone jealous." "And that's exactly why you're so good at what you do," I said, gently squeezing her hands. "You care about doing a good job, not about competing with others." She nodded, then looked at me curiously. "So you own this company now. My little Billy, all grown up and successful." I laughed, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. "I couldn't have done it without you. You gave me a chance at a better life." Over the next few weeks, things at the company settled into a new rhythm. Mrs. Rodriguez became our lead trainer, teaching new hires the importance of integrity and hard work. One evening, as we were closing up the office, she turned to me with a twinkle in her eye. "You know, Ashton, I always knew you'd do great things." I raised an eyebrow, amused. "Oh yeah, how's that?" She smiled, that same warm smile I remembered from 30 years ago. "Because even as a little boy you had a big heart. And now look at you, running a successful business, treating your employees with respect. I felt my cheeks flush with pride. I learned from the best. Mrs. Rodriguez patted my cheek affectionately. We both did, my son. We both did. As we walked out of the office together, I realized that sometimes life has a funny way of coming full circle. Mrs. Rodriguez had saved me all those years ago, and now, in a small way, I had also saved her. From that day on, she was more than just an employee to me. She was family, and every time I saw that scar on her arm, I was reminded that sometimes our deepest wounds can lead us to our greatest blessings.